I'll just edit it down.
Water, sparkling water, beer, right? No, it's not a party. A couple of drinks. I can make it.
Gina. No. Where is
He says no.
Okay. I asked the right one.
I've never lied.
What's so calm back there?
Okay. We're not waiting for one more.
Okay, where am I? Now we start.
Now it's like it's a huge magic. Here on
Greetings, one and all. Today is the 83rd anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And I'm glad to be able to present this to you today. Thank you all for coming. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is a watershed event in American history. The attack rips America away from its policy of isolation sought by many in the 1930s and 1940s. It thrusts America into becoming a world power, a position it is yet to relinquish. The attack begins on December 7th, 1941, but the story begins many years before that. So let's explore the genesis of this great battle. In the next few minutes, we're not going to follow a chronological script, but relate events by their importance. So be prepared for some jumping around in the early parts of the 20th century. We'll explore political decisions, overconfidence, miscommunications, mix-ups, misunderstandings, logistics, racial bias, strength of both adversaries in men and equipment, military preparedness, and naval analyst predictions of war in the Pacific. Hector Bywater, a British journalist, his influence on World War II in the Pacific is quite likely more significant than almost any other single individual who's not in the military, but he doesn't live long enough to observe the beginnings of the hostilities. Bywater writes a book, this book, 1931, The Great Pacific War, originally published in 1925. He creates a fictional war between the United States and Japan fought between 1931 and 1933. Bywater doesn't begin his fictional war as the Japanese will later do, but by destroying the Panama Canal. He has the Japanese sail a freighter filled with explosives into Calabria Cut and detonates it there. The Calabria Cut is an artificial canal cut through the mountains of the Continental Divide. Thousands of tons of explosives take the canal out of the picture for the war. This might be one of the first references to what we now call a terrorist attack on such a massive scale. With the canal needing massive reconstruction, the United States Navy must sail around the Horn, and the Imperial Japanese Navy is waiting for them. The IJN rolls to an impressive victory, killing 2,500 Americans. Bywater devises the Japanese attack south and the capture of Guam and the Philippines. However, contrary to what the Japanese actually do, Bywater suggests that they stop there and consolidate their empire. By doing so, the Japanese would create an almost impenetrable defense zone, and able to maintain their defense zone with a much smaller standing navy. Now, Bywater creates the island hopping technique used by the Allies to win back all the captured Japanese territories. He does create an attack on Hawaii, but it comes from within the population of the islands. He creates an internal revolt begun by the Japanese living there. In the book, it fails. Furthermore, he devises the idea of the Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands that will take place just prior to the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. Every commander on both sides of the upcoming conflict reads the book. One man who reads the Bywater book is a younger Japanese naval attaché in Washington, D.C., named Isiroko Yamamoto. He becomes a disciple of Bywater, and the Japanese follow much of the Bywater blueprint through the beginning of the war, all in print 16 years before the war begins. Interestingly enough, Hector Bywater never travels to the Pacific Ocean, on which his war, Japan versus the United States, plays out. In 1940, Hector Bywater mysteriously dies in southern England. A poorly done autopsy is performed during the afternoon of the heaviest German raid in the entire Battle of Britain. Autopsy results indicate alcohol poisoning. But for those of you who believe in conspiracies, many believe that Yamamoto, now head of the Japanese combined fleet, had Bywater murdered because he developed the plan the Japanese were going to use to create their Asian empire. In 1941, the U.S. and Japanese navies are about equal in the number of ships. However, the Japanese have more fleet aircraft carriers, 10, all in the Pacific. The United States has 7, but they're deployed in 2 oceans, 3 in the Pacific and 4 in the Atlantic. The 3 in the Pacific is a generous number. Enterprise and Lexington are stationed at Pearl, but Saratoga is just finishing a major overhaul in Bremerton, Washington. And when December 7th arrives, she will just be arriving in San Diego. The Japanese Navy in 1941 has about 300,000. The Japanese Army, 1.7 million in uniform. While the United States, all services, United Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, total about 600,000. So the sun arose on a beautiful day in Hawaii. Palm trees swaying in the clustered around the central mountains of Oahu. What can be more magnificent than a sleepy Sunday morning in Hawaii? Suddenly, from the north-northeast, 152 airplanes swept across Oahu and destroyed the fleet at anchor. They attacked the airfields and destroyed all the aircraft on the ground. Not one single shot was fired by the defensive forces protecting the island. Every major ship in the harbor was damaged or destroyed by the attackers. A complete surprise, a complete success. Commander of the attacking force, Rear Admiral Harry Yarnell, United States Navy. The date, February 7th, 1932. The attacking force used sacks of flour to simulate bombs and flares to demonstrate the effectiveness of strafing runs. The umpires of this, known as Fleet Problem 13, declared the attacking force to be the winners. So decisive was Yarnell's victory, it took the defenders of the Navy of Hawaii more than 24 hours to find Yarnell's fleet. With ships at sea like these, untouched during the attack on Oahu, all the ships in Pearl had been deemed too damaged to go to sea or sunk in the harbor. How did Yarnell achieve such an incredible success? Well, Yarnell maintained that Japan had always started operations by attacking before a declaration of war. Japanese torpedo boats attacked Russian battleships in Port Arthur, China, before a declaration of war in 1904. Back to our British spy and journalist Hector Bywater for a moment. He wrote in a publication in 1921 that Japan would attack the United States without declaring war first. Consequently, Yarnell chose to mimic the tendencies of Japan when planning his attack on Pearl. War between Japan and the United States had been studied and plans had been made in War Plan Orange beginning begun in 1906. Let's examine War Plan Orange for just a moment. In its earliest form, War Plan Orange is overconfident, simplistic, and naive. The original plan is short, a couple of pages, document that calls for the American Navy to sail across the Pacific, kick some Japanese backside, and sail home victorious. Let's explore the fallacy of this plan. San Francisco is nearly 7,000 miles from Manila. A Japanese invasion of the Philippines would have put War Plan Orange into effect. That distance alone, with no intermediate refueling or resupply stops, is daunting for a fleet and would take many weeks to traverse. A battleship like the USS Texas, an option not available until 1914, had a range of 7,000 miles at 10 knots. At that speed, it would take just over 29 days to get from San Francisco to Manila, and the fuel tank would be dry upon arrival. Remember, War Plan Orange was written in 1906, so prior to the USS Texas entering the fleet, not one single ship in the United States Navy could make the crossing without refueling. The Texas would have been one of the more capable and the longest range ships in the Navy, the rest of the fleet significantly less so. Please note the overconfidence of the U.S. Navy. In case you were wondering why they couldn't refuel at sea, in 1906, when War Plan Orange was originally written, no one had envisioned refueling at sea. Replenishment of fuel at sea wasn't developed till later by the British. To summarize and simplify, had the Japanese invaded the Philippines, the United States Navy would have had to sail across the Pacific, win the battle, and refuel in the Philippines. Otherwise, they wouldn't have enough fuel to return home. This exploration of War Plan Orange demonstrates many of the holes in U.S. Armed Forces thinking. What War Plan Orange does do is build a false sense of superiority within the United States Navy versus the Japanese naval forces. As we shall see, this superiority feeling goes much deeper and will create more troubles for the United States Navy. Now, back to Fleet Problem 13 and Admiral Yarnell. Another reason his plan worked so well, according to many, was Yarnell broke the rules. It must be remembered, that the United States Armed Forces between the wars was a stodgy, good old boy network. The most powerful men in the Navy were the battleship admirals, men who had been battleship captains prior to their promotion to admiral. They ruled the U.S. Navy. The first rule Yarnell broke was not taking a single battleship in his fleet to attack Pearl Harbor. He left them in San Diego. Yarnell was captain of the Saratoga prior to becoming an admiral, and the Saratoga is an aircraft carrier. He believed in the power of aircraft to take war to the enemy. Not many others did in the 1930s U.S. Navy. Yarnell snuck out of San Diego in the middle of a storm and followed that storm across the Pacific, all while maintaining radio silence. His force struck at dawn on a Sunday morning, time later deemed by the defenders as inappropriate for an attack. The top brass of the Navy even wrote to the War Department to argue that low-level bombing of ships at anchor was unrealistic because everyone knew that Asians lacked sufficient hand-eye coordination to engage in that kind of precision bombing. Prejudice and superiority, again, clouding American thinking. Eventually, the War Department put enough pressure on the umpires to make them reverse their decision and declare the defenders of Oahu the winners of Fleet Problem 13. Whatever the outcome, the U.S. Navy decided on giving to Fleet Problem 13, the Japanese didn't care and weren't paying attention to the squabbles of the U.S. Armed Forces. The real results of Fleet Problem 13 were widely reported in the newspapers. The Japanese Navy was paying attention, and U.S. intelligence knew that the reports were being sent to Tokyo. At the beginning of the 1930s, Pearl Harbor isn't the great naval base that it would become. It's a relatively small refueling stop for Navy ships. The channel is narrow and difficult to maneuver around Hospital Point. More than a few Navy ships, 11, have run aground entering the sanctuary of the inner basin. As late as 1936, the channel was too small for any fleet aircraft carrier to even attempt to enter, when carriers called, they anchored offshore. In 1939, dredging began, and 13 million cubic yards of material were removed from the inner harbor and the channel to allow easier and safer access to and from the Pacific. The sun arose on another beautiful day. Palm trees swaying in the breeze. Puffy clouds clustered around the central mountains of Oahu. What could be more magnificent than a sunny Tuesday morning in Hawaii? The aircraft arrived from the northwest to attack Wheeler, Hickam Airfield along with Pearl Harbor. The aircraft had snuck into range of Hawaii under the cover of a storm and launched on a Tuesday morning. Again, the attack was a complete surprise and no significant resistance was mounted by the island's defenses. Planes were destroyed, ships were sunk. Again, the battle was with sacks of flour and flares to simulate battle damage. This was the result of Fleet Problem 19. The commander of the attacking force was Admiral Ernest King, and the date, March 29, 1938. The result of this attack, as far as the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army was concerned, was no different than the 1932 attack. An effective air attack of Pearl Harbor and neighboring bases wouldn't be possible with adequate reconnaissance of the surrounding sea, which may have been true. But no attempt was made to put search aircraft into the air around Hawaii to watch for what might be coming. To scout the ocean surrounding the Hawaiian Islands to a distance of 750 miles, recommended by both Army and Navy experts, would have required 200 B-17 flying fortresses. However, in all of Hawaii, there were only 12 B-17s, and only 6 of those were operational. The 1938 attack of Pearl Harbor had one big difference regarding the Japanese. They were paying attention. They were watching this time because they were concerned about what the United States might be doing regarding Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1932 and China a few years later. This time, the Japanese naval attaché watched, saw what happened, and reported the details to Tokyo. Now, several important events happened in 1940 that added to the calamity of what was to come. The first was an order by President Roosevelt to move the home port of the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The move took place in June 1940. The move was made by Roosevelt to project power closer to Japan. The United States was closely observing Japan's expansionism, especially in China, where a full-scale war was in its third year. Admiral James Richardson, commander of the fleet, thought so little of the move to Hawaii, he went to Washington, D.C. to complain. Richardson had plenty of good, sound reasons for his objection. Pearl Harbor was vulnerable to attack. Pearl Harbor was being approachable from any direction. It could not be effectively rigged with nets and baffles to defend against torpedo planes. And at Hawaii, it would be hard to supply and train the crews. Pearl Harbor also lacked adequate fuel supplies and dry docks. Keeping men far away from their families would create morale problems. For his protest, Richardson was fired. Admiral Husband Kimmel took his place, and he too didn't like the fleet moving to Hawaii for the same reasons, but kept his mouth shut after seeing what happened to Richardson. The next event didn't take place in the Pacific Ocean, but in the Mediterranean, on the heel of Italy's move. It didn't involve Americans or Japanese. It was an air attack of the Italian fleet at anchor at Taranto, Italy, by the British. They used 21 obsolete Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. The British lost 2 airplanes, 2 killed, 2 captured. The Italians lost a battleship, 2 battleships heavily damaged, and slight damage to 3 other ships, 59 killed and 600 wounded. Now, Toronto Harbor is 75 feet deep. The American Navy analyzed the battle and decided that 75 feet was the minimum depth for an airdrop torpedo to be used. Pearl Harbor is only 40 to 45 feet deep. No need to worry about a torpedo attack in Pearl Harbor. The torpedo would drop too far into the water and stick in the mud on the bottom. However, Washington did warn the fleet in Hawaii about the possibility of a torpedo attack, and the response was, torpedo nets within the harbor are neither necessary nor practicable, saying ships at present are not moored within torpedo range of the entrance. The lesson of the airdrop torpedoes the British taught the Italians at Toronto was completely misunderstood by the naval commanders at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, on the other hand, asked themselves, how can we drop a torpedo into a shallow harbor and have it operate as desired? The depth problem had a twofold solution. One, they added wooden fins that broke away on water's impact, helping to break the fall. Two, they used a technique developed by Bradley Fisk, United States Navy, to approach at a much lower altitude, 20 feet above the water, as opposed to 300 feet they had been using. Now, while this is going on, things are heating up in the Atlantic. In March of 1941, President Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Navy to protect British convoys crossing the Atlantic as far as Iceland. On April 10, 1941, the destroyer USS Niblick depth charges a Nazi U-boat after the U-boat had sunk a Dutch freighter near Iceland. On 14 September 1941, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Northland destroys a German weather station in Greenland with naval gunfire. And finally, on October 31, 1941, a German submarine, U-552, sinks the U.S. destroyer Reuben James, again off Iceland, killing 100 U.S. sailors. Consequently, all through 1941, the United States is siphoning off resources from the Pacific to the Atlantic to help the British. Meanwhile, the Roosevelt administration is putting the squeeze on the Japanese government. Roosevelt imposed a series of increasingly stringent economic sanctions. In 1939, the United States terminated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. On July 2, 1940, Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act, authoring the president to license or prohibit the export of essential defense materials. On July 26, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States, thus bringing commercial relations between the two nations to an effective end. 1 week later, Roosevelt embargoed the export of such grades of oil still available to be exported to Japan. Next, Roosevelt slapped an embargo effective on October 16th on all exports of scrap iron and steel. Now, Roosevelt made all these political maneuvers, even though he was reelected under the campaign promise to keep America out of the war. Now, Roosevelt wasn't slapping these sanctions on the Japanese in a vacuum. The Imperial Army was advancing in China and moving closer to U.S. bases in the Philippines and the British base in Singapore. He and the U.S. military were concerned about an attack on the Philippines, and that's where all the big American money was bet on the spot where the war was going to begin. Now, confounding factors appeared to be stacking up for what was to happen in the mid-Pacific. A quirk of command structure had the U.S. Army in charge of protecting the fleet while at anchor in Pearl and the fleet aircraft at naval air stations. The Army was more interested in protecting the planes in the easiest possible manner, and that meant against sabotage versus aerial strike. The difference being the aircraft at Ford Island Naval Air Station would have been parked as far apart as possible if an airstrike was anticipated, making targets more isolated. However, if sabotage was the main goal of protection, the planes would be parked closely together, requiring only a small number of guards to defend them. The planes were wingtip to wingtip, a wise decision against sabotage, crippling, versus an air assault. Furthermore, the United States military had been using a numerical system for years indicating readiness for conflict. Ready state number 1, the highest level, and ready for imminent hostilities. Level 3 was normal operations, minimal threat preparedness. Well, General Walter Short, commander of the Armed Forces and Army Armed Forces on the island of Hawaii, changed the numeric system to the opposite of everyone else. When he reported to Washington, they were at level 1. Government officials thought Hawaii was in its highest ready state, when they were not. They were at their lowest level of readiness. So the sun arose on another beautiful day, palm trees swaying in the breeze, puffy clouds scattered around the central mountains of Oahu. What can be more magnificent than a sleepy Sunday in Hawaii? At 6 a.m., approximately 250 miles to the north of Oahu, planes with a red ball of the rising sun on their wings and fuselage began taking to the skies from 6 aircraft carriers. Commander Mitsuo Fushida in command of the aircraft. At Opana Point, facing the North Pacific at 532 feet above the sea level, was a newly installed radar unit, an SCR-27B mobile unit. But it isn't that mobile, because it needs 4 trucks carrying the transmitter, modulator, water cooler, receiver, oscilloscope, operator, generator, and antenna to work. This was one of 6 units placed around the island and had only been operational in this location since Thanksgiving Day 10 days before. On duty were Privates George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockhart. Their job was to operate the radar from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. Command thought the radar transmissions interfered with normal aircraft training operations during the day and had the unit shut off. Just shortly before the unit was to be shut off at 7 a.m., Elliott Lockhart saw the largest flight of planes they had ever seen. They notified command of their discovery, and Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was on duty. All the senior staff were at breakfast. But Elliott Lockhart didn't tell Tyler of the size of the incoming flight. Tyler knew of a flight of B-17s arriving from California and told Lockhart and Elliott not to worry about it. At 7:53, Japanese commander Fushida would order Tora to be sent to the fleet from his plane, indicating complete surprise had been achieved. Aboard the USS Nevada on Battleship Row, the colors were being unfurled and the band began playing the national anthem. Heading toward the unsuspecting were 43 Zero fighters, 51 dive bombers with 550-pound general purpose bombs, 40 torpedo bombers, and carrying Type 91 torpedoes and 49 high-level bombers. The first wave had arrived. As the bombs began to fall and the strafing runs began, the band on the Nevada finished playing the anthem, then dropped their instruments and ran for battle stations. Aboard all the other ships at anchor, the same chaos was erupting. The ammo, however, was all locked away while they were in port, but it didn't take long for the return fire to begin. The first wave of Japanese attackers concentrated on the ships at anchorage in Pearl, and they did a masterful job of inflicting damage. First, let's look at the USS Shaw, a destroyer. The Shaw was in dry dock, received 3 bombs, 2 forward and 1 amidship. An attempt was made to flood her, but it failed. She sank with her dry dock. Of the battleships in port, USS West Virginia, 7 torpedoes, 2 bombs, sunk, 106 dead. California, 2 torpedoes, 2 bombs, sunk, 100 dead. Utah, 2 torpedoes, complete loss, 64 dead. Oklahoma, 5 torpedoes, turn turtle, complete loss, 429 dead. Tennessee, 2 bombs, 5 dead. Maryland, 2 bombs, 4 dead. Nevada, 1 torpedo, 6 bombs, 60 dead. The Nevada was the only battleship to get underway and was heading out to sea. The Japanese saw this and tried to sink her in the channel to block the harbor. But her commander beached her on Hospital Point. Lastly, the Arizona, hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs, 1 descending through all decks to the forward powder magazine before exploding. Complete loss, killing 1,177 sailors, admirals, cooks, ammo handlers, and almost everyone in between. 1,102 still on board, 72 blasted overboard or died later of their injuries. Only 335 survived. Japanese wave number 2 arrived shortly after the departure of the first attacker. The objective for these 171 bombers and fighters were different than the first. They went after aircraft and storage depots. They attacked Hickam and Wheeler Airfields. They shot up Schofield Barracks near Wheeler. And as an aside, should you ever visit Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, the tracks of the machine gun bullets impacting the walls on the barracks are still visible and have been untouched since December 7, 1941, as a reminder to all. The pilots of Wave 2 simultaneously attacked Kaneohe, Barbers Point, and Ford Island naval air stations. They destroyed fighters, bombers, air-sea rescue planes, and any other targets of opportunity. 188 aircraft destroyed, another 159 damaged. What Wave 2 didn't do was destroy the 4 million gallons of fuel oil stored for the ships and the fleet. Had the fuel for the fleet burned and the facilities been destroyed, the U.S. Navy would have had to retreat to San Diego to rebuild, and the war would have lasted longer than its August 1945 ending. Isiroko Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, Japanese Navy, wanted a two-pronged attack on Pearl Harbor. Consequently, 5 submarines were deployed to the Hawaiian waters with midget submarines attached to their decks. These midget subs, or Kaitan, were to be released outside the entrance of Pearl, sneak in, and launch their 2 torpedoes of the anchored fleet. The 2-man crew for these Kaitan knew they were assigned to a suicide mission. These midget subs were operated by electricity stored in batteries. 3 of the 5 had immediate problems after launch with systems on board and never entered Pearl. Kazuo Sakamaki was commander of one of those 3. His gyro compass failed, and after running out of power and drifting for several hours, his sub ran aground and he escaped to the shores of Waimanalo Beach. When he was captured on December 8th, he was destined to become the only POW in captivity for the entire duration of the war. Sakamaki was the only survivor from the midget submarines. He wrote a book in 1949 called I Attacked Pearl Harbor. Later in the war, the midget sub Sakamaki commanded was towed around the U.S. on a flatbed truck for war bomb tours. A donation to the war effort allowed access to the boat and a glimpse inside. At approximately 4 a.m., one of the midget subs was spotted by the minesweeper Condor, and they notified the destroyer USS Ward in the early mornings of December 7th. The Ward, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge, was patrolling outside the entrance of the harbor, and the lookout spotted a periscope at 6:35 a.m. Following closely behind the cargo ship Antares entering the channel. The Ward fired their 4-inch deck gun at the intruder and thought they had a direct hit. They followed with a depth charge run, but could not confirm the sinking. The typical method for confirming a sinking was spotting an oil slick. But these were all electric subs, so they had no oil slick to observe. The Ward radioed a report of their actions to command, but because it couldn't be confirmed, command ignored the report. Now we have one more Kaitan to track, and the last one makes it all the way into Pearl and is spotted northwest of Ford Island by the destroyer Monahan. The midget sub fires 1 torpedo at the USS Curtis and a second at the Monahan, both miss. The Monahan rams the sub, sending it to the bottom. The Japanese plane disappeared from the sky above Hawaii, over as quickly as it had begun. The Japanese fleet of 6 aircraft carriers and sporting ships head back to the west and celebrate a great victory. The Japanese may have gone, but the killing was not over. Earlier in the day, the carrier Enterprise had launched 6 fighters to search for the Japanese attacking force, with instructions to land at Fort Island Naval Air Station after their mission was complete. In the early evening of December 7th, before the planes were determined to be friendly, understandably nervous gunners shot down 4 of the 6 planes. 3 pilots were killed. As a result of the anti-aircraft fire, aboard the submarine tender USS Argonne, another life would be lost. A stray bullet penetrated the Argonne's port side, killing Seaman Second Class Pallas F. Brown and wounding Seaman First Class Leonard Price. Both men had survived the sinking of the USS Utah earlier in the morning. The question then becomes, who developed the plan to defeat the United States Armed Forces at Pearl Harbor? A reasonable argument can be made for the recipients of the attack, the United States and our ally, the British. The Japanese crossed the Pacific with 6 aircraft carriers hidden in a storm, leaving November 26th, while maintaining radio silence, just as Admiral Kings and Yarnell had done in 1932 and 1938. They had learned the British lesson of aerial attack of ships at anchor from Toronto, Italy. The United States had taught the Japanese how to achieve surprise at Pearl, and Admiral Fisk, United States Navy, had solved half of their aerial drop torpedo problems. All they had to do was pay attention, put the pieces of the puzzle together. We planned the attack, they carried it out. Meanwhile, the United States Navy began licking its wounds, burying the dead, and beginning the process of rebuilding. When the bombs had stopped falling, the United States still had 3 fully functional aircraft carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise in Lexington near Pearl and Saratoga just out of San Diego. The devastation brought to Pearl Harbor and the American Armed Forces was massive. The real miracle of Pearl Harbor is the recovery and replacement speed for the damaged ships and aircraft. Remember the destroyer Shaw? Temporary repairs were made in December 1941 and January 42. She was patched up enough to begin a voyage to San Francisco for major repairs on February 9. She returned to Pearl and the fleet on August 31st, 1942, just 9 months after being sunk. Battleships Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania returned to the fleet in less than 2 weeks. Nevada rejoined the war in late 1942. She sailed to the Atlantic and was part of D-Day, June 1944, and operations in southern France before returning to the Pacific and the ending phases of the war. California is back fighting in 1943. West Virginia rejoins the fleet on July 4th, 1944. And she is there in Tokyo Bay when the surrender takes place. The Oklahoma was righted and was being towed to a scrapping company on the way to California when she was sunk in a storm. The Utah still sits where she sat in Pearl Harbor, and as we all know, so does the Arizona. In all, 2,403 American dead, military and civilian. In Hector Bywater's book, he predicted an American first battle loss of 2,500. Was the attack on Pearl Harbor the only time Oahu was targeted by the Japanese? Anybody? Well, the answer is no. 3 months later, bombs fell near Pearl Harbor as part of Operation K. This time they were dropped by 2 Kawashini H-8K Emily seaplanes. The planes were flown from the Marshall Islands to French frigate Shoals, part of the Hawaiian chain 500 miles northwest of Oahu. Refueled by a submarine and sent with 4 bombs, each weighing 550 pounds each, to Pearl. The Japanese planes were spotted by radar 200 miles out, and fighters were sent to intercept. The weather was poor over Pearl with heavy rain showers. The American fighters couldn't find the bombers, and the Japanese bombers couldn't find their targets. The bombardiers had to estimate where to drop their bombs. 4 bombs were unaccounted for and must have landed on the wave tops, and 4 bombs landed on Mount Tantalus, 6 miles due east of Pearl, breaking a few windows and making a few large craters, injuring no one. The irony of this rate is that, again, an American idea is used against the United States Armed Forces. An article published in 1941 titled Rendezvous by Lieutenant Wilford Jasper Holmes of the United States Navy, retired, under the nom de plume of Alec Hudson, told the story of an attacking seaplane being refueled at sea by a submarine and continuing on to bomb its target. The similarity to Operation K is undeniable. So who fired the first shot? We did. The Ward fired the first shot of World War II. The target of the Ward's gun crew in early morning December 1941 now lies just outside the entrance of the harbor of Pearl Harbor with a 4-inch hole in its conning tower. The first round fired by the United States Navy beginning the World War II in the Pacific. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addresses Congress and asks for a declaration of war against the Japanese. In that brief speech, he makes a statement that transforms America forever. No more are the days of isolationism. The United States is thrust into world leadership. The final thought of this Roosevelt quote is one of the most significant in U.S. history. I interpret the will of the Congress and the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make very certain that this form of treachery shall never endanger us again. Any questions? If there are no questions, I'm going to add a little epilogue on to this. I'm going to tell you about two different ships. One of them is the story of the light cruiser Phoenix. It's quite fascinating because this ship was heavily involved in battle after battle in the Pacific theater throughout World War II. In her first battle experience was on December 7, 1941. She was anchored at Pearl Harbor. She was one of the first to begin firing against the Japanese invading forces. She was completely untouched, and by noon, this is a picture of her passing by the Arizona, which is still on fire. She's on its way out to sea with several other cruisers and destroyers to search for the Japanese attacking force. Later in the war, the Phoenix was a flagship for General Douglas MacArthur with his invasion of New Guinea. In 1943, she returned to the United States for overhaul, and after her refit, she was tasked with taking Secretary of State Cordell Hull to Casablanca. After that assignment, it was back to the Pacific. This time after time, the Phoenix was part of the bombardment force, softening up the resistance for island after island, invasion after invasion. She was attacked by kamikazes on multiple occasions and only suffered minor damage. The Phoenix was part of the invasion force to retake the Philippines, and it was there that her only shipboard fatality occurred. A bomb exploded on the waves nearby, and shrapnel killed one sailor. She was a lucky ship. Battle after battle, only one person killed in 3+ years of action. After the war, the Phoenix was sold to the Argentinian Navy and was renamed the General Belgrano. Anybody remember the General Belgrano? Well, on May 2nd, 1982, the lucky ship's luck ran out. A torpedo from a British submarine, HMS Conqueror, struck the General Belgrano and sent her to the bottom of the Atlantic with a loss of 323 sailors, almost half of all the Argentinians lost in the Falklands War. Now we're going to go back and we're going to see what happened to the USS Ward, ship that fired the first shot of World War II. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Ward was modified to become a fast troop transport. And while performing this mission on the morning of 7 December 1944, while patrolling off the invasion areas of the Philippines, she came under attack by several kamikazes. One hit her amidships, bringing her to a dead stop. When the resulting fires could not be controlled, Ward's crew was ordered to abandon ship, but the Ward refused to sink. The burning hulk became a navigation hazard, and the destroyer USS O'Brien was ordered to sink her. Ironically, the commander of the O'Brien was William W. Outerbridge, who was the same man who had been in command of the ward on December 7th, 1941. So exactly 3 years to the day, he sent her to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, December 7th, 1944. And now, that's it. Yeah, he lost his gone. He became an admiral eventually, and retired from the Navy. He was a Annapolis grad. And if you ever want to see the ship, the gun that fired the very first shot of World War II, it is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you ask, why St. Paul, Minnesota? When they converted the ward from a destroyer to a fast attack transport, they realized that the men who were manning the ward were all members of the Minnesota National Guard, Navy National Guard on that day. And so they decided to take that gun, and it was on the grounds of the state capitol of St. Paul, Minnesota. So if you ever want to see the gun that fired, it did not go down with the ship.
I have a question.
Yes.
About, earlier on you talked about how the commanders and admirals and so forth weren't getting it all together too well. How long did that happen after Pearl, that we were finally coordinated enough to do what we needed to do next?
Well, I did this speech a couple days ago, and somebody asked me what happened to the people involved in that. Well, only 2 people really suffered out of this whole thing. And it took a while for the Navy to get its act together. In fact, it took the Navy a long time to get its act really together, and the Army too. Now, Husband Kimmel, the guy who took over for Richardson, he got canned because he was in charge of the Navy, and they blamed him for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Walter Short, the commander of the Army, got sacked, and they were both sent to early retirement. The Chief of Naval Operations, Stark, I can't think of his first name, he got demoted. He became the chief of European theater operations and for the Atlantic. And the guy who led the second attack on Pearl Harbor in 1938, Ernest King, he became chief of naval operations. But other than that, there was really no one other than those 3 people. 2 people completely lost their service career. 1 person kind of got. Other than that, no recrimination. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, he stayed in the Navy. He was the one who said, "Don't worry about it." He stayed in the Navy, and he was promoted as normally would be promoted through the ranks. So he suffered no ill consequences from it. But, for the most part, well, there are a couple things that come into play here, depending on how long you think the Navy came to get better at what they were doing. Between the end of World War I and the start of World War II, not one single test shot of any torpedo, live torpedo, had ever been made by the U.S. Navy. The Navy Bureau was making these torpedoes, and they would put wood warheads on them, and they would fire them at a ship, and they'd hit the ship, and they'd say, well, it would have exploded. Well, when they put the real warheads on it, the real warheads weighed about 2 to 3 times as much as the wood warheads weighed. And so they would fire these torpedoes at Japanese ships or other ships, and they went way too deep, and they'd miss the whole damn thing. I'm a jerk. Missed the whole darn thing. And it took until 1943 to get the Navy Bureau to understand that their torpedoes didn't work. And the only reason they did it is because the captains kept coming back, submarine captains kept coming back saying we fired all our torpedoes, and only 2 of them fired, or 3 of them fired. And finally, the head of submarines in Pearl took a submarine out, and he loaded it with torpedoes, and they fired it at a reef at the side of the island. And half to 3/4 of them didn't go off. And so it took them 1.5 years to figure out that the torpedoes didn't work. So your question about how the communications work, in some cases it worked pretty well, but in other cases it didn't work so well. But it's just like any other big organization. The right hand doesn't always necessarily know what the left hand is doing. Any other questions? Well, okay, that's a great question. And one of the things that Dr. Bywater talked about, I talked about a little bit. He said he thought that you take Guam and the Philippines and stop. And if they'd done that, they would have had a smaller area to protect, and they probably would have been able to do it because the United States wouldn't have had anything. Well, first of all, they may not have been that interested in taking it back. Both are United States territories at that time, and Guam still is. But they're 7,000 miles away. So what's the United States going to do? They're going to send a task force across, try and take back the Philippines with no intermediary bases, nowhere to stop and refuel, nowhere to put supplies, nowhere to stock up, get ready to make this advance. So it would become a daunting task and probably a task that they would have said, forget it. I don't know, I'm going to get deeper into it here in a second, but what happened after World War I, Japan didn't take part in World War I for all intents and purposes. Now, Germany had extensive colonies in the South Pacific. And when Germany ended up losing, the Japanese went in and took all of their colonies. And everybody whined about it, but nobody did anything about it because it would have been too difficult for them to do something about it. And what they ended up doing was they just finally said, well, that's the Japanese mandate. We're going to give that stuff to them. We're not going to worry about it. We didn't want those colonies anyway. So that became the Japanese mandate, and they took over, I don't know how many hundred islands in the South Pacific that the Germans had been in control of before. So let's say Japan decides to take a small area and they've got their Japanese mandate. No one's going to come. The British aren't going to do anything. The United States isn't going to do anything. They're just too far away. So they probably could have kept all that stuff if they stopped at that point. Now, when they started going farther, when they went to Hong Kong and Singapore and the Philippines and all those other places that they went to, then it starts rounding the cages of all the other powers in the United States. And the Japanese had always felt that they were a second-class society compared to the rest. And that's part of the thing that drove them into doing this. The Washington Navy Treaty of, I don't remember what year it was, but it basically said that England and the United States could have 5 capital ships being a battleship, aircraft carrier, cruisers, that kind of stuff. And the Japanese could only have 3. So for every 5 the United States and Britain had, Japan could only have 3. Well, that made them mad. And they decided they were going to get even with those guys. So that prompted them into doing stuff that maybe they shouldn't have done in the first place if they thought about it a little bit more. So there's racism taking part not only in the American side, but there's racism taking part on the other side, looking back at the other populations. So it's way more complicated. It's really complicated when you really get down to the brass tacks about all that stuff, but you can see how it gets going here. Any other questions?
What year did Hawaii become U.S.?
59. I don't remember when we moved in, but we moved in and basically said, we're taking over. And but I don't remember what year, it was probably in the 1800s. Sometime in the 1800s when the United States moved in and started reaping the rewards of the Hawaiian economy at the expense of the Hawaiian nation. That's, yeah, I'm not sure, but I would have
I was
guessed.
gonna say her name, Queen Mary, Queen.
Started with an L if I remember
Yeah,
correctly, but I remember it.
She was essentially isolated in her residence somewhere around the turn of the last century.
That's kind of what I was guessing, 1900s.
It's not a long time since
I don't think I've ever been on a tour. Yeah, so the United States moved in the early 1900s, and it became a territory. And we've had the Philippines since 1899, the Spanish-American War. And we also had a whole bunch of other places that we took from Spain in the Spanish-American War. But basically, we took the Philippines in about 1899, 1900, something like that. Any other questions? All right, class is excused.
And wine, I think, is ready. So, another wine tasting. Okay.